Hey, you're listening to the On Humans podcast, and today's episode is about shamanism and the lessons it can teach us about religion and the human mind. Now, shamanism is a fascinating topic, but unfortunately it often becomes so exotic that the threads of our shared humanity are hard to find. Yet there's one scholar, I think, who doesn't lose those threads, an anthropologist who can join the dots between rituals in the rainforest and the operations of our minds in urban modernity. That scholar is Manvir Singh, the author of Shamanism, the Timeless Religion, and I've long wanted to have him on the show. Yet someone got to him first. Kensy is the host of Many Minds podcast, probably the most similar show out there to On Humans. Actually, I learned about it first because on social media someone posted that these are their two favorite podcasts. So Kensy and I met this November in San Diego to chat about podcasting and decided that it would be a good time to introduce ourselves to each other's audiences. So here you go. If you like this, do check out Many Minds on whatever app you're using. And if you are, by the way, an early career researcher or a storyteller working with intelligence, whether animal, human, or artificial, and might want to spend some time this summer with like-minded people, do check out the Diverse Intelligences Summer Institute, which the podcast is part of. You will find links to it in the show notes. And of course, do stay tuned for the next episode with me behind the microphone as usual. And this one will be one of the most iconic guests on the show so far. I won't spoil the surprise, but you won't have to wait for long. But now let's go with Kensy in conversation with Manvir Singh.
Welcome to Many Minds, a podcast about our world's spectacular varieties of mind and what we can learn from them. We feature conversations that shed light on the diverse ways of thinking, sensing, and being that are out there. I'm your host, Kensy Cooperrider. Thanks for joining us. When you hear the word shaman, I'm guessing a web of associations starts to form in your mind. Perhaps you imagine strange ceremonies and strong substances. Maybe you think of an earlier time when magic and superstition reigned. But shamanism is not just some relic of the past or a curio from exotic lands. It's part of our present, and it will almost certainly be part of our future. This is because the roots of shamanism lie within us all. My guest today is Dr. Manvir Singh. Manvir is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of California, Davis, and a regular contributor to The New Yorker. He's also the author of a new book, Shamanism, the Timeless Religion. Here, Manvir and I talk about his fieldwork with Mentawai shamans in Indonesia. We discuss what makes a shaman, and consider the cognitive building blocks that make shamanism so widespread and so appealing. We discuss the shamanic origins of Abrahamic religions. We consider how, over the course of history, shamanism has repeatedly resurged, despite attempts to snuff it out. And we also talk about the various forms and flavors that shamanism takes in contemporary Western societies. Along the way, Manvir and I touch on drumming, fasting, and the dark tent, Jesus, experimental Edens, witches, prophets, and messiahs, glossolalia, disenchantment and reenchantment, the rise of Neo-shamanism, Paleolithic rock art, hedge wizards and tech CEOs, Western exceptionalism, and the routinization of charisma. If you enjoy this episode, I highly recommend that you check out Manvir's book. It's a captivating blend of narrative and ideas, and it goes far beyond what we were able to talk about here. I'll also flag that this is Manvir's second time on Many Minds. Back in July of 2020, we had another conversation, broader in scope, where we talked about shamanism, but also Manvir's work on witches, stories, and music. So you might check that one out as well. All right, friends, on to my conversation with Dr. Manvir Singh. Enjoy. Manvir Singh, welcome back to Many Minds.
Thank you so much for having me, Kensy. I'm really excited to chat.
So as part of your work in Indonesia, you observed a number of shamanic rituals. Could you just describe one that, for whatever reason, sticks out to you?
This is one I talk about at the very end of the book. So it was during an initiation, and during a shamanic initiation, there are many of these dances where the initiate and a number of other shamans will get on a dance floor and then do these dances that are understood to be very beautiful. They're called Lajot Simagre. It's kind of the quintessential practice of Mentawai shamanism. And so I remember it was during the shaman's initiation. I really wanted to go watch the dance, and I was told it'll start at midnight. And I wake up, I've just been like awake and sleeping throughout several days. My whole sleep schedule is totally messed up. And I hear the dancing starting next door, and I go over. And so during Lajot Simagre, what happens is the shamans are, so in Mentawai, the Sikere, typically during their shamanic ceremonies, where I work in Indonesia, they only wear loincloths. They cover their bodies in turmeric. They often have tattoos. They have their long hair. Then they will dress themselves in beads. They'll put feathers. They'll put leaves. And all of this is understood to make themselves very beautiful for spirits. Because one of the senses of why you get sick is that your soul might leave. And so they are summoning souls. They're interacting with spirits. And so they want to look very beautiful to the spirits and people's souls. And so they start dancing in circles. And that is to the accompaniment of drumming. Typically among the Mentawai, the drumming is on reptile skin drums, monitor lizard skin drums, or a python skin drum. And so there's drumming over there. Then the Sikere, these shamans, start dancing. And while they're dancing, they have a very particular kind of dance, but then they're also tapping their feet on the floorboards. And so they themselves are musicians. They're kind of contributing to this soundscape. And then they start to sing. And the singing is, it's this like hypnotic, really interesting singing. It uses a lot of falsetto. It might sound something like, but they sing together, coordinated. And then they're dancing, and they're dancing, and they're dancing. And one of them will have a bowl of magical leaves that are believed to invite spirits. And then they continue dancing in these circles. And then that will go on for a while. And then observers will start to fall into trance, like often maybe women, relatives of the shamans, and then the Sikere themselves will fall into trance. And this is an indication to everyone involved that souls and spirits are flooding to the dance floor, and that the power of healing is occurring. But they can only dance for so long, and so then, and often, one will fall into trance, another will fall into trance. Eventually they might fall into the drummers. The drumming has to be stopped. Then they are slowly pulled out of trance. The drums are heated up again, because the drums need to be heated to remain tight. And then they will be pulled out of trance. Then they will sing. And then the dancing will start again. And this will go on all night, maybe for, an hour or two. They will be entering these trance states. A lot of the observers will. And then at some point, they kind of switch out. And then it becomes essentially like a party. And so the night that I'm remembering, that I'm keeping in mind right now, other women will start to replace them. Other people will start to replace them. And then they'll just be dancing until the morning. People will be taking cups of coffee to stay up. And this is one of the things that has been really striking about shamanism, especially among the Mentawai, where these healing ceremonies, my association with healing is that it's solemn, it's somber. But these are parties. They're performances, they're theatrical, but they are so especially celebratory.
Right. Is that because this was a particular type of healing that they were attempting? Or
this one was this was a part of the initiation, so it was itself quite a celebratory moment. But I'm thinking, I've been to a number, especially when they have Lajot Simagre, when they have this dancing, and then the dancing gives way to other dancing, and they have another thing called Kutkere, which is another dancing ceremony. I've been to ones where a patient, so in the book I talk about attending this one ceremony. It was to heal a shaman, and his feet had this really treacherous ailment. They were scabbing over. He couldn't walk. And the ceremony was incredibly celebratory. I will say I've also been to shamanic ceremonies where the illness has been much more grave. So in the book I talk about attending this one ceremony for a child. I think he was like 7 or 10 or something. And it was not successful ultimately. He passed away. And that one was more solemn. But even then, there was still like a sense of sociality, of connection. People are chatting. It didn't feel as kind of solemn as I would have expected coming from the particular healing context that I'm familiar with in the West.
Is it your sense that these shamanic practices it's Mentawai, right? I have that pronunciation right, Mentawai?
Mentawai. What I say is Mentawai.
That they're relatively stable, that it's been like this for centuries, or are they constantly changing as far as
my sense is that they're constantly changing. And there are a couple of indications of this. So when you go there right now and you go to these shamanic ceremonies, they will be using bells. They put on dress skirts, they put on beads, and all of these I think the bells came in through trade with the Dutch. The Dutch had colonized Indonesia the beads are with Malay traders or the Dutch. So the cicada institution as it exists is quite shaped by recent forces. But then you also know that they evolve or that they're dynamic because ceremonies in neighboring areas will be a little bit different. I mean, how long has it involved dancing and trance? Maybe that has been much longer. But even while I've been there, I've seen small variations in these ceremonies.
Yeah, there's sort of this idea. I don't actually know if anthropologists take this idea seriously, but there's sort of this idea that certain pockets of culture, certain aspects of culture change more rapidly than others, right? That some have more inertia. I'm just curious, like, is shamanism an especially dynamic pocket of culture, do you think, or do you think it's actually one of these that has more kind of inertia?
Oh, interesting. Well, so first, anthropologists definitely do think about.
They do talk about this.
Yeah,
okay.
there's some really interesting papers using cultural phylogenetics where you can see which aspects of culture are more liable to vary than others. So I would actually say I think there's some theoretical disagreements. A theme of my book is that these traditions evolve, that they're dynamic, and I've actually had an anthropologist reach out who is under the impression that ritual itself is much more conservative. So I would say even I don't think there's so much agreement on that point. But yeah, I mean, my impression is that that the tradition itself, having shamanism, is pretty consistent. And a thesis of the book is that it reliably redevelops and it's incredibly compelling. But I do think elements do definitely change, especially in response to like changing social conditions. I mean, shamanism and ritual magic are often so entangled with the foreign. The foreign has power. And so like as who is foreign changes, the tradition itself changes. I mean, that's just one example. Yeah, or as theories of illness change in response to different trends, then of course who the shaman is engaging with changes, or how they are removing the illness changes.
So I thought maybe at the start here we could talk a little bit about how the sort of public understanding of the shaman as a figure, shamanism as a set of practices, differs from what you as a scholar anthropologist understand shamans and shamanism to be. What is that difference?
So I think, and this was an impression that I think I had before my PhD, I think among many people, shamanism is wrapped up with this imagery that is a bit primitivist, a bit exotic, a bit archaic, maybe a bit orientalist. People are very okay saying that shamanism is a very old religion, or that you found it in Siberia, or you found it in the Amazon, or you find it among Koreans, the Koreans being kind of this more orientalist dimension. And there has always been this weird game of gymnastics where anthropologists are trying to say some things are shamanism, but other things are not. That everything I just described is shamanism, but Hebrew prophets are not shamans, or everything I just described, but Pentecostal pastors are not shamans, or, trance channelers, or even, there's been an interesting trend where people have wanted to say that Siberian shamanism is shamanism, and Amazonian and North American practices are shamanism, but in sub-Saharan Africa, you have something else. You have spirit mediumship. And so I think maybe the biggest distinction, or the most important point that I am making, is that these games are not justified, that these weird definitional gymnastics that people are trying to engage in are not justified, that if you want to say that practices in Siberia, the Amazon, and Korea are all shamanism, then you need to also include sub-Saharan Africa, you need to include Pentecostal pastors, you need to include Hebrew prophets, you need to include trance channelers you find in LA. I mean, the basic thesis is that shamanism is this hyper-compelling tradition that reliably redevelops, but then the implication is that so much of this weird gatekeeping that has historically been the case, where people have wanted shamanism to overlap with the primitive and archaic, is not justified.
So you describe shamanism as, at various points in the book, a sort of package, a cultural package, like a set of features. You describe it as a super attractor at some point. Could you say a little bit about what you mean by those kinds of definitions? So like, what is a super attractor idea, for example?
Yeah, so super attractor builds on or plays with this idea of the attractor proposed by the French cognitive scientist and philosopher Dan Sperber. So Sperber's argument is that cultural evolution or cultural transmission is predisposed to converge upon certain traits, what he calls attractors. So an example that he likes to talk about is Little Red Riding Hood. I can tell you the Little Red Riding Hood story and then I can forget how it ended, but there's something cognitively attractive, culturally attractive about that end, and so that end will kind of reliably build itself. So the idea of a super attractor is that it is this complex composite, this package, as you talked about, that is built of many attractors, built of many interacting parts. So shamanism is built of trance, of engaging with unseen realities, of healing and divination, and then also very often these other things, dramatic initiations, psychoactive substances or music, drumming, dancing. And so the idea is that shamanism is this cluster of different practices and beliefs that seem to move together and reliably develop together. And I think a priori, it's a bit puzzling. Like, why should you find this particular constellation of practices and beliefs that come together so reliably? What about them is so attractive? And that is something that I've long tried to understand.
Yeah, this was something I was struggling with in the book a little bit, is it that all the ingredients of shamanism, all of the parts of this package are just super prevalent, and then so naturally, inevitably, the overlap of them is also prevalent? Or is there some coherence to the package? Like, is there some gravitational force that binds all these things together?
Yeah, the argument is that it's the latter. So the idea of a super attractor is that it's not just that you have a number of attractors that, because each is an attractor, move together, but that they interact in some dynamic way and they move together in some dynamic way to give rise to this larger whole.
So is shamanism, strictly speaking, universal in your view?
Strictly speaking, it is not universal. There are definitely societies that we know of that did not have shamanism.
And so what's going on there, do you think?
So the best case studies for societies that do not have shamanism are very small hunter-gatherer populations. So the Northern Ache is a group that I've thought a lot about and recently written a bunch about. There have been these cross-cultural projects to try to document societies that do not have shamanism, and it's societies like the Northern Ache, the Tiwi, the Hadza, the Siriono. And what all of these share is that they're very small populations. And in several of them, we actually know through historic reconstructions that these populations did have shamanism. So the Northern Ache are part of their Tupian group, and we know that historically ancestral proto-Tupi groups had shamanism, they had horticulture, and then the Northern Ache seem to have undergone a lot of cultural trauma. They've undergone a number of cultural bottlenecks, and they've lost not just shamanism, but corporate groups, something like clans or lineages, the ability to make canoes, knowledge about most horticulture, but then also very extreme things that we would often assume cultures cannot lose, like the ability to make fire. And then more recently, a colleague and I have provided evidence that they lost dancing, they lost lullabies. And so these, just because I'm like maybe a pedantic anthropologist, insofar as I want to be strictly definitional, shamanism is not an absolute universal, but now we also know that dancing and lullabies and the ability to make fire are not absolute universals. Shamanism is nevertheless ubiquitous, emerges very reliably, incredibly common.
So the way you see it, if you have the right cultural conditions, the right, say, population size and sort of resource levels or something, then you would expect shamanism to kind of almost always emerge. But in some cases, because of crashes or resource problems or whatever, it sometimes falls out.
Yes. If we created an experimental Eden, or, we created 100 new societies on 100 empty islands somehow, I would expect shamanism to be in 99 or, 98 or maybe all of them. I really do think shamanism is an incredibly, to use our term, super attractive practice.
Okay, so maybe now we can start digging into the framework that you lay out in a little bit more detail. So you define shamanism as having these kind of three key criteria. So shamans are people who, one, kind of cultivate altered states. Two, in order to interact with unseen realms or unseen agents. Three, to provide certain services like healing or divination. So those are do I have those three?
Yes.
Right. So maybe we can just kind of zoom in a little bit here. So what is this altered states thing? How do shamans cultivate altered states?
So the techniques are incredibly varied, and these states have been referred to, sometimes they're called altered states of consciousness, non-ordinary states, trance, ecstasy, hysteria, but the techniques include very often drumming, dancing, music, rhythm, sometimes psychoactive substances, hallucinogens, psychedelics in a small number of societies, some other psychoactive substances, darkness. So there's a tradition that you find throughout Eurasia and into North America called the dark tent, where the shaman would go inside a small tent in total darkness. Sometimes they would be tied up. Self-denial, so fasting. Then there's also, there are traditions in which shamans had cultivated the ability to lucid dream. You found this, for example, in some Peruvian groups. But yeah, I would say the main ones are dancing, drumming, and then to a lesser degree, psychoactive substances.
So what's going on with the drumming exactly? Like, do we know about the sort of psychology of that? Does drumming reliably get people into some kind of other headspace?
I mean, it seems to, yeah. We have yet to, I think, do a lot of really interesting work on how these states are induced, how they compare with each other, what are their subjective effects. I mean, right now you have a huge explosion of that kind of work in psychedelic states. So, there's increasingly great characterization of psychedelic states, but I think there's a lot of variation in what these states look like. And so, I mean, there was a great review by Vital in 2005. For rhythm-induced trance, they say it makes you more aroused, which I guess makes sense. It increases your awareness, it decreases self-awareness, and it increases sensory dynamics. So things like, hallucinations, rich sensory input, or feelings of sensory dynamics. So, but again, this is, I think this is also under-theorized, also under-empiricized, and I think there's a lot of really interesting work to be done. But if you look at like neo-shamanic practice in the United States and in the West more generally, which I talk a little bit about in the book and which I've also engaged in, if you go to one of these neo-shamanic circles and then they do the drumming, it's pretty effective in my experience at inducing like some striking imagery.
Oh, interesting. Even imagery. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but that is actually distinct from like dancing and
right.
kind of dissociating.
So then would drumming be one of these ingredients of shamanism, like one of these attractors within the super attractor cluster? Like it does get used for purposes other than shamanism, but it also binds with other aspects of shamanism. Is that how you would think about it? Or
so the way that I think about shamanism is I think about there being the core defining features and then these like secondary elements that very often occur but don't necessarily always occur.
Right.
And I think about drumming and music as one of these secondary elements.
Okay.
And so they are attractive and they interact with the other elements of shamanism, but they are not kind of a defining constituent feature.
Right, right. When I was thinking about this altered states thing, it struck me that sometimes shamans are actually doing something to very obviously enter an altered state, and other times they may be doing something to cultivate the appearance of an altered state. Is that a distinction that you think makes sense, or do you...
Yeah. I mean, that's even a distinction that people in many societies are talking about. So among the Mentawi, there's a sense of like, is this legitimate? Is this not legitimate? I mean, they talk about that with any kind of possession or trance state. I mean, I can show you videos and you can see sometimes when shamans enter trance states, people will laugh. And, it's both because like it can be a little messy and they're like bumping into people. But I think also some of it can look a little more transparently theatrical. So yeah, I think that is a kind of a discourse and a distinction that a lot of people constantly have on their mind.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned as another one of these secondary features, fasting or other kinds of self-denial.
Yeah.
What is going on? What is going on there? Like, does fasting also contribute to entering an altered state? I guess it can in an extreme case, right?
There are two things that are happening there, and they actually correspond, I think, to two very different elements of shamanism. So one, some shamans will fast during their initiations. They'll go into the wilderness and subsist on very meager fare. They will also, during their career as shamans, maybe have to deny themselves sex or food to a very large degree compared to other people. And these, I think, are linked to a sense that the shaman is becoming a different kind of entity or is a different kind of entity. There is a general conception or perception that self-denial somehow changes a person or it cultivates a special ability or cultivates special powers. And so I think part of what's going on is that. But then I do think there is a separate thing, which again, I think more interesting research has yet to be done, where fasting in preparation for certain ceremonies seems to predispose these kinds of non-ordinary states or altered states.
Yeah, I was partly interested in it because fasting is one of these things that, as far as I understand, is also practiced in a lot of like new religious movements as a sort of social binding agent.
Yes. I think there's a third function that is separate from these two.
Okay. Yeah. But it sounds like for these shamans, it's maybe what's important is that the audience knows that they have been denying themselves these things less than, what is not having sex going to do to the shaman's altered state? Not much, but it might make the shaman look like they're on some other plane. They're doing something non-human or whatever.
Yes. Well, and I think this is something that is there with a lot of shamanic practices where they have a performative dimension. And I think that performative dimension is sometimes for, very much promoting a sense to the audience, also often to themselves, that they are a different kind of entity. Although I do think and I think this is less the case for sex, but I think through denying themselves food, there is a strong experiential dimension. The extremity or intensity of that experience, I think, can signal to others that they are transforming, but can also really signal to themselves.
So, let's talk a little bit about why these altered states are important here. What are they doing for the experience of the shamanic ritual? What are they doing for the shaman themselves?
I think this actually builds nicely on what we're talking about. An important dimension, I think, to these altered states is what I call performances of otherness. So as an example, let's say one of your family members was sick, and I came up and I said, hey, Kensy, I can treat this person's illness. I can speak to the rain goddess or the, illness goddess that is causing this illness. I think you would naturally be skeptical. You would think oh, you're just a regular person. And so I think here is where two features of shamanism are very relevant. One is the ways in which I'm understood to be a different kind of human. I've denied myself this food. I've gone into the desert. My skeleton has been replaced. I've had a death and rebirth ceremony. But also in the moment, the engagement with these unseen forces, insofar as it looks distinct from normal human functioning, I think makes it more compelling. And so if, I'm just chatting with a rain or an illness goddess in a normal voice, I don't think that would be very compelling. But if I seem to dissociate and, I'm babbling and I forget the experience afterwards and a new voice comes through my mouth, I think that would much more credibly and compellingly look like I am engaging in this activity. And I think that performance can be, obviously a big part of it is for the community and for the client, but I think also for the practitioner, to the extent that the practitioner sincerely feels themselves to be engaging with some kind of other entity. I think that also makes it more compelling for everyone involved.
I see. So kind of just to put it coarsely, it's more credible that someone who has non-human features could be engaging with non-human entities.
It's an idea that I call xenizing, this sense that we feel that other individuals have special abilities to the extent that they seem distinct from normal humans. And so in the book, I use the example of superheroes, where in the superhero narrative, what needs to be established is that this individual has powers that normal people do not. And the way that this is done narratively is through the origin story, which is about showing that this is a fundamentally different kind of entity. They've been bitten by a radioactive spider. Actually, they're an alien. They have some wide-sweeping genetic mutation. Whatever it is, they are essentially transformed to make more credible, to make more compelling, to make more tenable the sense that they can do things that normal humans cannot. And I think a lot of shamanism is about serving a similar function, serving this what I call xenizing function, transforming them both fundamentally over the long run and in that moment to make it more compelling to everyone involved that they have these special powers.
Yeah, just to kind of underline something you were saying there is it sort of operates on the two time scales, right? It's shamans are both people who seem to have traits of otherness, stable aspects that make them sort of other or not simply human, but they also cultivate states of otherness at the same time.
Right.
So in the human case, what would be traits, stable aspects of people who are shamans that mark them as being other?
So it's incredibly variable. It depends on the context, and it also often depends on the powers that they are invoking. So among the Mentawai, a big part of the shaman's initiation is transforming their eyes. So it's believed that as a shaman, it's really critical that you can see souls, spirits, you can speak to them. And so a big part of the initiation is treating their eyes regularly with all kinds of magical substances, often in public, so that they can have these different kinds of eyes. But then also, more generally, there's a lot of self-denial, so there's a very specific sense of they're developing new eyes, but then there's also a general sense of they are slowly maturing into a different kind of being. And then once they come out of that, there's a different word. So when you're a regular person like you and I, you're called simata, which means uncooked. It means unripe. It also refers to fruit and food. And then to become a shaman, it's ukere. There's a verb, to shaman, to shamanize, essentially. And then once you come out, then you can't eat a lot of the foods that we regular people eat because you will die. You have this kind of different constitution. So that's how that works among the Mentawai. But again, it's incredibly variable. So in some societies, it's actually like you have another finger that predisposes you to becoming a shaman. In many societies, if you frequently dissociate or enter trance states or seem to, maybe you're epileptic, that's also common. I mean, in some societies, if you get struck by lightning, that's seen to predispose you. So there are many dimensions of otherness that shamans can kind of move along to build this sense of special powers.
So one of the early scholars, maybe one of the earliest scholars of shamanism that you discuss in your book, is this Romanian scholar, Mircea Eliade. Mircea Eliade. Could you just say a little bit about him?
Eliade is a fascinating figure, incredibly erudite, incredibly talented. So I think by the age of 30, he had already written like 10 books or something. He had a number of articles. He had gone to India, learned, I think, Sanskrit, had an affair with the Indian poet Maitreyi Devi. He always thought of his mastercraft as fiction and novel writing, but he is really known today, especially outside of Romania, for his work on the history of religion. And one of his major works is this book, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. He wrote it originally in French, and then it was translated into English. I will say there has been a change in how people think about and write about Mircea Eliade. I don't write about this in the book, but it seems like he had some fascist leanings, and so there's a lot of kind of revisionism and perspectives of him. Just feel like I should throw that out there. But yeah, so he has this really remarkable landmark book, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, where to that point, there's a sense that, okay, people are starting to use this term that was originally from Siberia and used for Siberian practitioners, shaman, in contexts outside of it. But this book makes the argument that this prototypical form of shamanism is in Siberia, but that it then, probably because of historical reasons, fragments or elements of it appear in different parts of the world. But he had this very particular vision of what shamanism was. He said it was soul journeying, so it's when practitioners enter ecstasy and their souls are believed to leave their bodies. He said they go to upper worlds or lower worlds. He associated it with imagery of flight, of mastery over fire, of association with animals. And so that really, for a very long time, dictated how people thought about shamanism. They said, oh, shamanism is soul journeying or soul flight. It's in this cosmology, a tripartite cosmology. And if you look at neo-shamanism as it's practiced in the United States or Western Europe, it is very much in the mold of Eliade. There's a sense of soul journeying or soul flight, and there's this real insistence on this tripartite cosmology. We now know that that didn't really apply to Siberia, let alone the entire world, that Siberia is much, much more diverse, that when these practitioners who are called shamans enter these states, it's sometimes understood to be soul journeying, sometimes understood to be possession, sometimes understood to be something entirely different. And there's a sense that Eliade had kind of forced or projected his very particular schema onto the diversity of the world's traditions.
I see. He sort of had happened to pick a particular regional flavor of shamanism and treated that as kind of the prototypical or sort of core case of it for some reason.
Yes, and it's not even clear to what extent the form he described actually applies to
the region.
Yeah, to the region.
Right. I see.
Like Siberia, we now know is much more diverse. Even the groups from whom the word shaman seems to appear, these Tungusic-speaking groups, like the Evenk, they had much more varied shamanic practices and cosmologies. So there has really been a push against this Eliadean projection, but he has been a very important figure insofar as he did a lot of really important work identifying parallels, or at least pointing to parallels.
Right. He got the field going, but ultimately he didn't quite have the breadth of comparative perspective that you think is needed to really make sense of this phenomenon.
Yeah, and it's double-edged, his contribution. So on the one hand, he, I think, really invited an ambitious cross-cultural global comparative perspective on shamanism, but then he really poisoned it, because then there was this sense of of what we might call Eliade's mistake, where other people are very resistant to using the word shaman or shamanism across cultures because they think it ends up bastardizing or distorting the world's traditions to fit a particular scheme. And I think, my book is a real attempt to not do that, to respect the diversity, have a definition that I think is more justifiable, to engage and represent traditions as they appear in their diverse richness. But there are many people who would find a project like what I did to be very unappealing and problematic because, I think, in large part of Eliade's mistakes.
So the title of your book is Shamanism, the Timeless Religion. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily put shamanism and religion together. They think there's some like sort of fundamental difference between the two. How do you see the relationship between shamanism and religion more broadly?
I think there's been a long-standing tendency to think that shamanism is the world of magic and religion is the world of Christianity and Islam, etc. But there have been these attempts to really identify what are the core features of religion as it appears across culture. So there's this great book, I'm probably mispronouncing this person's name, but Martin Riesbrot has really tried to identify when we're talking about religion, what are we talking about? And his basic claim is that religion is about appealing to supernatural agents for blessings and to avoid misfortune. That it's kind of this instrumental relationship with the supernatural and the divine. And that is what shamanism is. I mean, shamanism and prayer, they look very different, but they are both appeals to supernatural agents to get blessings and avoid misfortune, to deal with the uncertainty of the world. And so, we can point to, of course, shamanic traditions vary in the extent to which they are centralized, institutionalized. But I think at their core, shamanism is a religious practice. And this tendency to call it magic and not religious, I think, is again part of this longstanding project to primitivize it and kind of present it as foreign and exotic.
Yeah, just thinking about what you just said about prayer there. Has anyone say this? Like, it seems like during prayer, people also do things to make it seem more plausible, either to themselves or others, that they are communicating with non-human
For sure.
entities.
For
Like
sure.
changing the speech register, changing the intonations, these kinds of things.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of really cool work happening now and in recent years on the ways in which techniques of prayer allow people to kind of experience the divine in ways that they would otherwise not, kind of predisposing their mind to interpret sensory details in a particular way, closing off particular sensory input and inviting other sensory input, allowing themselves to reinterpret maybe internal speech or dialogue. So I think there are many indications that in a way very different from shamanism, arguably, but nevertheless in a way that's important, that prayer makes experiences of interacting with supernatural agents more compelling.
You write in the book, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact formulation, but that it's hard to imagine any form of religion pre-existing shamanism or predating shamanism. Is that an accurate paraphrase, more or less?
Yes.
Okay.
I would argue that.
So what about things like animism? Like, is that an inherently...
Yeah, the question is like, what are the cognitive building blocks for any
Right.
of these? And so, like, for shamanism, what are the most basic cognitive building blocks? In the book, I talk about what we might call a predisposition for superstition or ritual, engaging in low-cost interventions to try to influence uncertain outcomes, which is a tendency that seems to be that you find in other animals. A predisposition to experience agents and believe that agents are influencing the world you exist in, maybe certain cognitive quirks related to how we think about concepts and violating particular conceptual categories. All of these, I think, are like pretty cognitively primitive. And so then instead, I think to explain and understand shamanism, it's really about like all the things that I think make humans really culturally and socially special, having complex cumulative culture, being sufficiently cooperative that you can turn to other people for cooperative services. So I think we can think about shamanism in this very kind of like magical way, but I think when we really try to zero down on what are its cognitive building blocks, I think they are the same cognitive building blocks that you find for something like religion. And so for that reason, I think like once you have a species, an ancestral hominin, a proto-human that was cognitively prepared for religion, you would predict just on the basis of a basic cognitive theory of shamanism that they would also be shamanic.
So what about in these contemporary cultures that you were describing earlier, like the Aceh, that don't seem to have shamanism? Do they, they presumably still have these cognitive building blocks, obviously, but...
Yeah, so they're also like demographic. I guess, yeah, you're right. There's like the cognitive building blocks that you need, but then I also think you need some demographic variables. You need a group that is sufficiently large to be able to maintain the cultural complexity involved in shamanism. And so, yeah, you're right. If you had ancestral humans, the Aceh, groups like the Aceh and the Siriono are so kind of culturally peculiar. Again, they've even lost the ability to make fire. They can maintain fire and they keep fire, but they don't know how to make it. And so I would be skeptical or apprehensive that like human populations often had kind of were demographically analogous or comparable to those kinds of conditions. But you're right, like you could have a society that was sufficiently small, disconnected, materially impoverished.
Yeah, I was just thinking that like people there might still have high rates of like animist beliefs or that kind of thing, belief in the supernatural, but not actually practice shamanism per se. So let's talk about the sort of big picture history of shamanism. You discuss in your book some of the evidence for shamanic practices already in the Paleolithic. Could you, maybe just sketch that evidence for us?
People have proposed a lot of archaeological evidence for shamanism in the Paleolithic. These burials, they're often rich burials, often of women. They sometimes have like physical differences or peculiarities. You know, are they shamans? I think it's actually pretty debatable and open to interpretation, but some of these have been named shamans. So I don't think that's great evidence, to be clear. People also point to rock art. There are all different kinds of shamanistic theories of rock art. Again, I think that's very open to interpretation. I think it's very debatable. I don't think that's very strong. So instead, I argue we can incorporate these first two lines of evidence, but I think they should not have a huge bearing on what we think. I think there are some other indications that shamanism was widespread in the Paleolithic. First is that it's ubiquitous among modern populations, including among nearly all hunter-gatherers. So then you would need one of two theories for how that occurred. One is convergent evolution, and then the other is some kind of cultural diffusion or transmission. So, one is that shamanism was maybe invented in some place. Maybe it was before humans left Africa, and then they carried it everywhere they went. The other is that there is something about our psychology and social dynamics and culture that predisposes us to reconstruct shamanism everywhere we go. I argue for the second, but the implication is the same in both of them. Regardless of which one you hold or subscribe to, they imply that shamanism has a very deep history. I think there is evidence that shamanism has been carried over and diffused across, land masses, but I think just given how diverse the different manifestations of shamanism are, in the book I use the analogy of flight. It's like, some shamans are doing this kind of lucid dreaming thing. Others are using dancing. Others have psychoactive drugs. In some places, it's a very solitary activity. In others, it's a very social activity. It's just so diverse in its manifestations that I think it's more justifiable to think of them as analogous forms than as some single tradition that has been carried and diversified. I also think, I haven't gone through this in so much detail, but I think there are good cognitive reasons to explain shamanism. I think it's very cognitively compelling, and I think culture does a pretty good job of redeveloping things that are very cognitively compelling, that satisfy our desire to control the uncertain. But then also just historically, we see so often shamanism recreate itself. Powerful authorities try to destroy it. Maybe they're successful for a short time, but then it recreates itself so reliably afterwards. It's also very hard to quash, all of which implies a very strong pull or attractive dimension to it. So I think on the basis of all of that, we can conclude that it's had a very deep history and that it has probably existed for as long as we've been cognitively modern.
So to just quickly revisit the case of like the cave paintings, you mentioned, I think maybe you could just say a word about, is it David Lewis Williams? There's this whole theory about certain cave paintings being good evidence for shamanic practices. Could you just say what are people looking at there that they think provides that evidence, even if you think it's kind of not super rock solid?
Right. This idea is most often associated with Lewis Williams, and his argument is that trance states involve 3 stages. In the first, you see geometric shapes, you see circles, you see lines. In the second, those become figurative forms, you see animals. And in the third, you are kind of traveling, you're experiencing flight. This is this more phantasmagoric state. And then this imagery is merging, you're merging with your imagery, and then you are seeing or experiencing animal-human hybrids. And so his argument is that the rock art that we see, when we see lines and dots, that is corresponding to this first stage. When we see animals, when we see buffalo, bison, horses, that is corresponding to the second. And then when we see these animal-human hybrids, these strange figures, those are corresponding to the third state. And that rock art is essentially produced by shamans who are in trance. My view is, I think a view shared by quite a number of people, that you don't need trance to explain dots and lines and circles. You don't need trance to explain bison and horses and
Right,
reindeer. And you don't need trance to explain animal-human hybrids. There are many alternative explanations here, and this should, while it's possible, it shouldn't necessarily be our leading hypothesis.
Right. The animal-human hybrids, for example, those seem like those are cultural attractor independent of any association they might have with shamanism in some traditions or whatever.
Right. I mean, shapeshifters are incredibly common. Having supernatural entities who are animal-human hybrids is quite common. And you can argue that, yes, these are common, but these are always devised by shamans who are in trance. But I think that really undersells or undervalues just like human imagination and creativity. You don't need trance to explain thinking up really interesting hybrids.
Okay, so maybe we could move forward a little bit in the arc of history. You have a whole section in the book where you talk about how some of the early days of the Abrahamic religions may have featured shamanism, even though they're not often described in those terms. So actually, maybe first of all, we could just talk about like, why is it that people have resisted talking about the Abrahamic religions in shamanic terms?
A couple reasons come to mind. First, again, like we were talking about, shamanism is so wrapped up in the foreign, the exotic, the primitive. I think there's a sense that shamanism is always other and it's far away, and to see it in early Christian history, early Abrahamic religion in the Eastern Mediterranean is almost to degrade or like, it's almost like an insult. So I think one comes just with the biases and prejudices that are so often tangled up with shamanism. But then related to that is also a sense of biblical exceptionalism that, you know, yes, like the shamans are the heathens and the pagans, but this is the true history, or that the shamans are the other and the exotic, but this is the roots of Western civilization. So I think it's also linked to a sense of biblical or Abrahamic or Western exceptionalism that wants to pit the shaman as the other and this as something special and distinct.
Right. I mean, I totally buy that this is what's going on here. I was trying to think of like other cases where we do this, where we sort of resist pushing or sort of widening our comparative lens out to encompass Western traditions, even though like obviously there's a clear commonality connecting Western traditions to other traditions, you know?
Yeah.
Because it's got to be a recurring.
It must be. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So, but what do you take to be the evidence that there was basically shamanism kind of energizing from the beginning, these traditions?
I think it's very well established that the Eastern Mediterranean was a very shamanic place. Greece had the oracles, who are prototypical shamans. I mean, these are individuals who are entering non-ordinary states that are understood to be channeling supernatural agents, and then they're sharing these messages for the purpose of divination. I mean, if you saw that in any other cultural context, we would be much more eager to call that shamanic practice. We know that the Babylonians, you know, just Mesopotamia more generally had a very similar practice. And then the Hebrew prophets seem to exhibit these same features. I mean, the Hebrew Bible uses this word, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, something like nabi to refer to the Hebrew prophets. And then there are these related verbs, I think niba, hit nabe, which mean to act as a nabi. And as far as we can tell, the nabi and the verbs that are implying acting like a nabi are very shamanic. They're entering non-ordinary states, entering these ecstatic states. Sometimes these ecstatic states, so there's this line from 1 Samuel 19:24 where it says, he stripped off his garments and he too prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay naked all that day and all that night. This is why people say, is Saul also among the prophets? So this kind of behavior is described as ecstatic, as in this case, actually becoming naked and prophesying. Elsewhere, it's also associated with music. So like 2 Kings 3:15-17, while the harpist was playing, the hand of the Lord came on Elisha. And he said, this is what the Lord says. He has this prophecy. So you have another case where one of these prophets is divining. In this case, their divination is spurred on by music. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, this phrase, the hand of the Lord upon someone, seems to imply this kind of ecstatic prophetic behavior. So again, like if this were any other cultural context where you have individuals who are interacting with a sky god, that interaction is spurred on by music. They're entering ecstatic states, they're becoming naked, or they're having visions, and then they're prophesying. We would so easily call that shamanism. But as soon as we're observing it among the Israelites, it's kind of something that we are much more cautious about. So I actually think the case is like, I don't think it's very super debatable or uncertain when it comes to the Hebrew Bible. I think that it's like pretty clearly shamanic.
So the case becomes a little bit murkier when we move to Jesus himself, right? There's
yes. And so over here, I'm not the first person to make this argument. There's actually like an interesting literature in religious studies wondering or asking whether Jesus is a shaman. And so Jesus very clearly exhibits two features of shamans. He engages with unseen agents. So, he's exorcising demons, he's interacting with the Holy Spirit, and he is healing and divining. He's providing these services. I mean, that is maybe the clearest thing that he's doing. So then the basic question is like, is he entering non-ordinary states? Is he entering ecstatic states? And this is actually a bit of a debated topic. I will say, just on the basis of the cultural context, we know, again, that the ancient Eastern Mediterranean is super shamanic. We know that this tradition that he is emerging out of, that of Hebrew prophecy, is very, very shamanic. But then what is the evidence that he himself is entering these non-ordinary states? Now, there's debate. There are interesting suggestive passages. So Mark 3:20-22 is probably the passage that a number of scholars have pointed to and which seems intriguing. And so what this passage is describing is that Jesus enters a place, people are flocking to him for healing. He is described as, depending on your translation, out of his mind. He has to be constrained. And then observers are calling him demon-possessed.
Interesting.
So it's a very suggestive passage. You can interpret it in different ways. Maybe he's being religiously inspired or kind of astonished, and maybe people have to restrain him for some other reason, and maybe he's being called demon-possessed because people are just like, it's mudslinging, it's not actually because he looks possessed. And so this is the debate. But on the basis of this, and I think some other very intriguing passages, I think we should at least be more open to the hypothesis that Jesus is a shaman. And we also know that the early Christian church, as you have with so much centralized religion, really turned against ecstatic states. So you would predict then that anything that would emphasize Jesus as having been in an ecstatic state would also have been purged or left out of those accounts.
Yeah, I was wondering whether we think that they might have, his sort of more shamanic aspects could have been diluted in translation or over the centuries, basically, because it was seen as unseemly or untoward for the, quote unquote, real prophet to be engaging in this kind of whatever, more primitive or backwards kind of behavior.
And I mean, we know that the early church, I think even by around 100 AD, and you see this with so many religions, that they will start out ecstatic, pretty shamanic, but then as they become centralized and institutionalized, they turn on these shamanic and ecstatic elements because they are inherently threatening. So we know that the early church tried to recast a lot of passages in the Hebrew Bible to say that, okay, I know these sound maybe a bit ecstatic and charismatic, but actually these figures were much more serene and somber. And so it's not totally strange to suspect that maybe as the sections of the New Testament were being recorded or as these stories were being passed along, that some of these elements were removed.
Yeah. I found that so fascinating, this general dynamic you were just describing of religions will have a kind of shamanic birth where there's a lot of, emphasis on these other states and, ecstatic experience and that sort of thing. And then they become sort of more ossified and regimented, and they become sort of more of a, an organized religion with rules and hierarchies and that sort of thing, dogmas. But that there are continual efforts at sort of renewing those ecstatic foundations that the organization is also continuously trying to quash. That dynamic of history I found just really, really interesting. There's this phrase that I think sort of sums up this dynamic that I guess is a phrase from Max Weber of the routinization of charisma. Do I have that right? That's
yes,
kind of
exactly.
the way to describe this, yeah.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I think this is so important is that sometimes shamanism is presented as this proto-religion, as this earliest stage of religious evolution. But in fact, when you look at the evolution or histories of so many religions, I think it's less that it is the case that, yes, they often are birthed from very shamanic traditions, but then it's more that they are in constant tension or struggle with these shamanic elements and these ecstatic elements. It's not that one necessarily gives rise to the other, but that they are instead engaged in this constant tug of war, where you often have more shamanic or ecstatic splinters that are sometimes quashed, sometimes not, but then those as they themselves become centralized, often then remove or purge their shamanic elements. I mean, a great example is Mormonism. Mormonism started off super ecstatic. Joseph Smith talked about the gift of tongues. Brigham Young, the second president and prophet, celebrated what he felt was like an echo back to Christianity's earliest days. But then even within a few decades, you have a total change of policy against it. And gift of tongues, the meaning of gift of tongues is transformed from kind of these more ecstatic, what's called glossolalia or xenoglossia, speaking in tongues, to having the God-given gift of learning languages quickly for the purposes of missionizing. So it's a dynamic that you see very often and you can see very frequently, even in recent recorded history.
So yeah, let's maybe zoom ahead to kind of the other end of history, talk a little bit about shamanism in very recent times. Could you tell us a little bit about the case of Alice Amma?
What I like about the Alice Amma case is it is a really richly documented instance of one of these very common dynamics in which a figure starts out quite shamanic, but then becomes like a messianic prophet. And this is what we can imagine probably happening at the start of a number of religious traditions and has actually been observed in other places. So the story of Alice Amma, it's Uganda. I believe it's the late 1980s. And she was a member of an ethnic group called the Acholi. And so you had an Acholi president, but then he is overthrown and the presidency is taken over by Yoweri Museveni, who is actually still the president in Uganda. So whatever that is, like almost 40 years later. But so this happens, and then the Acholi, this ethnic group who previously held power, they are incredibly scared and frightened. There is a sense that the new government is going to try to exterminate them. They're asking them to hand in their weapons. You hear radio broadcasts about how they're thieves and, deserve to be killed or whatever, justifying violence. So there's a deep fear among them. And so Alice Amma starts off as kind of a typical shaman medium. But then she transforms her services from being a familiar medium into being a commando, a guerrilla commando. And she lays out a number of commandments. And she goes from kind of promising to heal people to promising to overthrow the government and install a new era that is free of sin, is happy, is blessed, is affluent. It's actually a narrative that is kind of similar to what you find in even many like populist nationalist movements right now. It's kind of like a backwards looking utopia. We will reinstate this golden age. And she creates this enormous movement. It becomes a pan-ethnic movement. She marches on Kampala. They eventually lose. Her movement falls apart, but it's taken over by a figure named Joseph Kony, who similarly presents himself as a shamanic figure, but also who can promise these amazing gains. And many of your millennial listeners might be aware Joseph Kony starts the Lord's Resistance Army that then terrorizes East Africa for, decades, takes a lot of child soldiers. But what I find striking about this example, so one is that it is a case where you can see shamanism in action, but you can also see the ways that shamanic figures can leverage their status to be these more kind of messianic or prophetic figures who then overthrow societies or drive these major historical events. And what you find in Uganda is actually something you find in many places. So the Taiping Rebellion seems to be started by a similar figure. These cargo cults in New Guinea seem to be started by similar figures, but even potentially a number of Christian heretic movements seem to be started by these similar figures who are shamanic, messianic, who promise restoration, who promise kind of a new utopia, and build these huge movements for it.
So yeah, I mean, do you think of a prophet or a messiah as kind of just like a shaman with a bigger platform or with a grander narrative, something like that? Or
I don't think all prophets or messiahs necessarily have to be shamans, but I think that there is a striking correspondence. There's a striking, again, reliability with which shamans become prophets or messiahs. And I think, it's about the scale of their promises and the scale of their platform and the scale of their community. So it's no longer like, I will banish the witch that is causing your illness, but it's like, I will destroy all of the witches that are causing our collective distress. And that can then be leveraged for making this huge movement. But at its core, it's a similar thing. It's engaging with unseen agents, promising to engage in battle with them, to deal with the misfortune and uncertainty in people's lives.
So part of what interests you in the Alice Amma case is not that it's a historical anomaly or anything like that, but in fact that it's sort of one instance of a much more widespread phenomenon. Like history is just dotted with cases of these little upheavals, upswellings of kind of shamanic figures. Is that fair to say? Or
Yes, exactly. I mean, what draws me to it is that I think it reflects the ways in which shamanism is not only common, but that these shamanic figures very often take on this profound social status and I think are responsible for some really big historical movements.
So yeah, I mean, I think some listeners, some readers of your book will read a case like that and think like, something like this couldn't happen here, right? That it's like somehow just too far removed from traditions in the weird Western industrialized world. Like it just couldn't take root here. But I think you make a compelling case that like, no, in fact, this happens all over. So maybe we can move to sort of more Western contexts where you see shamanism bubbling up. One is this movement, I guess you could call it, that you've already mentioned a couple of times, of Neo-shamanism. What is Neo-shamanism exactly? What does that refer to?
So Neo-shamanism is incredibly varied, but I think at its foundation, it is this new tradition or set of traditions where people are engaging in practices that are honestly like inspired by the academic study of shamanism. Again, there are so many traditions. I think historically it was a big driver of neo-shamanism is what is called core shamanism, which was started by this anthropologist turned guru, essentially, Michael Harner, who claimed to crystallize from the diversity of the world's traditions some core practice that then he packaged for a Western audience. And it was essentially Eliade that he presented, Eliade with drumming. So it's like, there's drumming and then you go on soul journeys and you go to the upper world or you go to the lower world. So a lot of neo-shamanism as it's practiced today is really rooted in this Michael Harner presentation, which again is very much rooted in what Eliade had written in Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. But then it's like infused and tinted with and transformed by understandings of other shamanic traditions, kind of the growing interest in psychedelics, the psychedelic renaissance. So, like so many forms of spirituality, today it has this kind of like individualist, varied dimension. You kind of pick and choose depending on your own preferences. But I think it's really grounded ultimately in Eliade.
Yeah, interesting. So this is a growing movement throughout Western Europe and North America. Is that where it's basically concentrated? Or?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it's most popular in Western Europe, the United States. If you look at where core shamanism, you can go to shamanism.org or shamanism.com, I forget.
Okay.
And you can look at where the trainings are. And they're overwhelmingly in the United States, some are in South America or Central America. But then similar neo-shamanic traditions are very popular in Western Europe. In the UK, they're like remarkably popular.
Right. Interesting. So I gather, like, even though, as you say, this is informed by kind of scholarly study of shamanism, it doesn't mean it's not itself shamanism. It still has the same three criteria.
For sure. I think the success of neo-shamanism is due in part to the same elements that have made shamanism so popular and successful across cultures, that there's just something incredibly compelling about, entering these non-ordinary states to deal with unseen agents or forces for healing and divination. I do, of course, think that like neo-shamanism is a very peculiar form of shamanism because it's like informed by the academic study of shamanism.
Right.
But I think at its core, it is a shamanic practice. And I think there are many people who want to put neo-shamanism on one side and so-called traditional shamanism on the other. But I don't think that is justified. I think all shamanic traditions are constantly evolving and changing and dynamic and responding to the world. And I don't think there's much that justifies putting all non-Western, supposedly non-modern traditions into one category and putting them in contrast to this weird form of shamanism that is arising. I think they're all forms of shamanism and they're all kind of peculiar and reflecting their particular histories and local environments in their own ways.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of like people wanting to say like, oh, there's traditional, whatever, Italian food and then there's modern Italian food or whatever. And it's like, what is the tradition? Like by that, you just have some time horizon in mind. Like you mean early 20th century Italian food. Like that's not like it's been churning up new aspects and flavors or whatever continually for hundreds of years. So it's
right.
Like, So aside from neo-shamanism, where else in the kind of modern Western world do you catch whiffs of shamanism?
Yeah, I love that wording, catch whiffs, because so we can identify literal shamans. So I mentioned this earlier. I think Pentecostal pastors, some charismatic preachers are literally shamans. I mean, they are communing with sky god, entering these non-ordinary states, speaking in tongues, and then healing or divining. That is, again, if viewed in any other cultural context, very simply a shaman. And I think there's just this apprehension again towards it because of a kind of Western exceptionalism. But then there are many contexts in which, we might find whiffs or shaman analogs. These aren't literal shamans, but they use shamanic techniques or they serve similar functions. And I'll mention two examples. So one are money managers. And I write about money managers. They're a class of what I call hedge wizards, which are specialists who promise control over ultimately uncontrollable and often unpredictable systems that have high stakes for people. And so like shamans, they are promising to forecast and manage these domains of uncertainty, even though it probably seems that they cannot, and what they're more doing is providing a sense of control. And what's going on often is that as they're competing with each other to find clients, they start to dress themselves in all of these practices and performances of credibility. And so with money managers, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about like what makes a particular money manager compelling, but there's a really interesting analysis by this scholar in the UK, Samuel Johnson, who his analysis is parallel to mine of shamans, where he really emphasizes the ways in which money managers cultivate perceptions of competence through perceptions of otherness. They have incentive structures that don't match normal humans. They work obscene work schedules, 100-hour work weeks. They are hedonic in a way that normal people are not. They're greedy in a way that normal people are not. Or they, are incredibly attuned to market dynamics, or they're incredibly charismatic and able to, rub elbows with everyone. But there is some kind of performance that convinces us that they are unlike regular people and thus have an insight that most people do not. So that is one analog. Again, I would be very careful to say that they are not shamans, but they're engaging or filling a similar social function. Also, as someone who lives in Northern California, another interesting context in which you don't have explicit shamans, but you have whiffs of shamanism, are tech CEO culture. And the thing that made me think about this first was just the emphasis on, again, deprivation and self-denial that you find in these spaces. I remember Elizabeth Holmes, just to provide one example, claimed that she subsisted on green juice, on like a blend of like spinach and arugula, and something that is actually impossible for a human to subsist on. Jack Dorsey was making claims that I think he was having like a meal a day or a meal every couple days.
Right. Yeah.
These are the kinds of claims that you so often find in shamanism. And again, we can ask to what extent is this performative and to what extent is this because they have the intuition that this allows them to cultivate special abilities. I think that same question often arises in any shamanic thing, but the implications are very similar, where you have these individuals who are engaging in self-denial, engaging in all other kinds of weird practices, infrared heat lamps. I mean,
right.
Also their own kind of emphasis on, whatever, psychedelic retreats, but then often advertising those or discussing those or making those a part of a public persona and identity, with the effect that promotes this sense of specialness, of charisma, of competence, of credibility. I spoke to Rakesh Khurana, who is a sociologist at Harvard, who helped me really understand this in an interesting way. What he was pointing out is that we currently have an ecosystem where it's a very high stakes ecosystem. It's like some companies will be worth $1 billion or $10 billion, but investors have very little to go by other than the charisma or specialness of these people. I mean, you have like, who did you go to school with? Where did you go to school? Who do you know? But then otherwise it's like, what is your personality? What kind of individual are you? And that really incentivizes these performances of charisma, of specialness that have also incentivized shamans.
Yeah. So I kind of going back to this issue we were talking about before of how there's sort of different ingredients of shamanism, different cognitive biases that it capitalizes on, different building blocks, that kind of thing. I couldn't help but think maybe like in the modern world, there's some sense in which this package, this super attractor, has started to kind of disaggregate a little bit. And so you are sort of seeing different elements of shamanism exist independently from the whole package. I don't know if I'm just curious if that resonates with you at all, or...
I think that does, actually. I mean, you have, a big emphasis on cultivating non-ordinary states in certain circles.
Right. Independent of whether you're offering services or that kind of thing.
Yeah. And then you have ways of healing that are shamanic in the sense of being maybe more communal or more personalized. And then you also have these other techniques of Zenizing in these other contexts. So I think you're right. I think it is, it is interesting. You potentially do have a disaggregation.
Part of what I was thinking about here is I was reading your recent piece in the New Yorker about Donald Trump as prophet, and I was kind of thinking about, okay, so like, is Donald Trump a shamanic figure? Or does he have like certain shaman vibes? And then I was thinking about and it doesn't, obviously I don't think it makes sense to call him
I wouldn't call
straight
him
up a shaman. It doesn't make sense. But also like it does seem like he's capitalizing on some of the psychological biases, some of the things that shamans also capitalize on. I mean, I was even thinking about how the fact that he, survived that assassination attempt.
For sure. Yeah.
In the eyes of his following.
For sure. It's his getting struck by lightning.
Yeah, exactly. It has Zenized him. It has marked his quasi-divine status.
Yeah, like structurally, in many ways, he's very shamanic. He's like providing monocausal explanations of misfortune, presenting himself as exceptional in precisely the ways necessary to vanquish them. He conjures up his own witches. Yeah, for sure. But again, I would not call him an explicit shaman. I mean, I think part of it is potentially related to the fact that in Western society, the ontology in which supernatural agents influence uncertainty has kind of gone away.
Right.
In many contexts. And as has how trance states are interpreted. I think they're much less often, although in some circles, interpreted as, genuine instances of divine engagement. But you nevertheless have these other social and psychological dynamics. You have desires to deal with uncertainty. You have misfortune. You have desires to understand misfortune, especially in the context of agents. You have a sense that people who differ from normal humans are more exceptional. And so then, like you have these maybe core elements that are distorted, but then you have other stuff that kind of fits around it and creates a new kind of psychological ecology.
Right. And also you just have more specialists in modern societies than you would have. You have more of a more finely differentiated set of specialists performing various kinds of, not even just performing services per se, but just doing different things for the community and so on.
Yeah. I would still emphasize that according to some surveys, it's like hundreds of thousands of Americans claim to visit shamans. Like shamanism as a self-reported religion is the fastest growing religion in the UK. More people say they're shamans than are Rastafari or Zoroastrians.
Right.
Or followers of shamanism. So you still have like
the real package, the full package.
But it is definitely the case that, you have these other interesting dynamics that are playing out.
You make this claim, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but something like shamanism has been with us for as long as we've been human and it will outlast us all. Sort of like it is destined to continue to be this force in human experience and human culture. And I'm just curious, like, why you're so confident of that, given what seem to be some other longer term forces at work that could be destabilizing it.
So what do you think are good examples?
Oh, I'm just thinking of this general idea of this, like the disenchantment of the world.
Yeah.
The idea that many people anyway, are no longer interested in or engaging with supernatural entities in the same way. As you note, it's still actually a lot of people. So it's not like we have fully disenchanted, just to be clear, by any means. But in terms of the longer arc of history, you could see that as a trend that might keep going.
So I guess I think it is definitely the case that some people are disenchanted. It is also the case that, a growing number of people follow astrology. It's the case that like a large swath of atheists say that a dead relative has interacted with them in recent years. I think there are certain cognitive styles, certain cultural contexts that can predispose a disenchantment. But I think just the architecture of the human mind means that you have a big bulwark to fight against if you think that there is a future in which shamanism will disappear. The fastest growing religion right now, I think, in some metrics, is Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity. I think you probably have more Pentecostal and charismatic Christians every year than you have atheists, and especially atheists who totally are disenchanted. So, I think like living in university towns and, coastal United States and somewhat formally educated circles might predispose one to think that the future is very rationalist and kind of post-enchanted. But I think on a global scale, that is a small trend right now, just in terms of human experience.
Right. And there's also increasing kind of chatter in, say, like the podcast sphere of, a re-enchantment, like a movement toward an actual movement in the opposite direction, even among coastal elites.
Right.
And so on.
Yeah.
Are you done with shamanism? Was this your last word on shamanism, or do you think it will keep resurfacing as like a timeless interest of yours through your career?
I think at various points in my career, I thought I was done with shamanism.
Okay, yeah.
And then
Yeah. Can't be snuffed out.
it can be snuffed out. I will say, I'm very interested in shamanism. I mean, I think it's like tremendously cool, but I'm also really interested in shamanism as a case study for thinking about certain cultural traditions that really resonate and develop super reliably, and for thinking about the ways in which we draw these distinctions that are sometimes a bit arbitrary or artificial or distracting. The ways in which I love this idea of anthropology. It's talked about so often, but that it's about making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And I think shamanism has, on a personal level, been a great opportunity to really experience that, to see the supposedly exotic in a much more familiar way and see the much more familiar in this kind of through this new lens. But of course, there are other things that I want to study, that I do study. And I imagine I will continue to engage with shamanism, but I also have a lot more that I want to explore.
So, I mean, I know you've obviously worked on witches. We talked about that in our last conversation. You've been working on narrative, I gather, for a while now. Are there other ones you would mention as like cultural packages or super attractors or things that you're eyeing as like, wow, we really need to understand that better?
I've been doing a lot of work on justice. Like, I think a lot of these like apparently secular institutions, justice, property, marriage, rites of passage are all super interesting. But I will say that just on a personal level, I really find super interesting narrative, music, religion, myth. I think there's just something aesthetically about them and, about the kinds of topics that I like to think about. And so right now I'm thinking a lot about narrative and myth.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to see more of your work in that direction. So I have kind of a bespoke reading recommendation request for you, which is your book is partly kind of a fieldwork memoir. And that's a genre that I've always loved. I'm just curious, what are some of your favorite kind of fieldwork memoir type books? Books that report where the author reports some like primary fieldwork experience.
Oh, interesting. I mean, like there are ethnographies that I think are awesome and amazing. In terms of fieldwork memoirs,
I mean, I guess the line between those categories is a little blurry, but I feel like
to what extent is the anthropologist a character in the book?
Right.
So I'll say that there are some ethnographies that I love, that I think everyone should read, where the anthropologist is not necessarily a super salient character. The book, so this was the first book that was assigned to me when I started my PhD, and it is a really profound ethnography. It's called The Sambia, Ritual and Gender in New Guinea. It's about, there have been different terms for this at different points. I think first it was called ritualized homosexuality. Later it was called boy insemination. Have you heard about this?
Oh, yeah.
And so that book is, I think, just a really, reading through that really profoundly affected my sense of the power of culture to shape something as fundamental as sexual mores and sexual preference. I think another incredible book, a very, very different kind of book, but a really important anthropological work, is The Falling Sky, Words of a Yanomami Shaman. And this is a first-person account. It's essentially kind of like a memoir or an autobiography by this Yanomami shaman, Davi Kopinawa. And there have been a number of these throughout history where an anthropologist works with like an informant and writes their autobiography, but a lot of them are over-curated. The anthropologist does a lot of rewriting of the story. This is an ethnography where this individual, Davi Kopinawa, describes his experience, his initiation as a shaman, but then also his encounters with outsiders, with colonialists, with cattle ranchers. And so you get an incredible view into Yanomami world. The footnotes alone are like an incredible anthropological ethnographic project. But then it's also, I think, a really beautiful and powerful depiction of how he views this encounter with the West. And he also interrogates in a way that I found really striking. I think we can sometimes narrate history as people live in, the Orinoco and the rainforest, but eventually they will become urbanized. Eventually they will go to school. Eventually they will, stop practicing their religion. Eventually they will stop hunting and engaging in horticulture. And I mean, the book does a lot of things, but one of them is like, that doesn't have to be the arc of history, and that's not necessarily that one we want to subscribe to. I mean, again, that's not like a main point, but I think it made me think about that in a way that I hadn't really before.
Manvir Singh, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you so much, Kensy.
The Many Minds podcast is a project of the Diverse Intelligences Summer Institute, which is made possible by a generous grant from the John Templeton Foundation to Indiana University. I'm Kensy Cooperrider. Thanks so much for listening.